All right, let's take that from the top. Welcome, everybody. We're here for our second meeting of the Winooski Parking Inventory Analysis and Management Plan. Second advisory committee meeting. The team has been busy collecting more and more data. You've seen the survey that's gone out, that's been shared pretty widely. And I think we've got some good stuff to show for you tonight. Maybe let's go around and just do a quick, well, first off, is there anybody from the public here? I don't see anybody. I did have somebody who was interested in joining us. I did communicate with them via email, so perhaps they will join us at some point. But seeing nobody from the public, I think we can skip over that part of the agenda for the time being and get back to reintroductions here. Again, I'll start. Jason Shrest with the CCRPC and the project manager for this on the CCRPC side of things, and I will pass it over to my coworker Chris.
Thanks, Jason. My name is Chris Dubin. I'm with Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission as well. Senior transportation planner, and really on this project focusing on the data collection, data elements of this project.
John Slayson, you want to take it from?
Yep, sure. Thank you. So Jonathan Slayson, from RSG, the project manager and data collection and analyst here, working with a few folks that are kind of hidden on the RSG team. And with me tonight, we have Andy Hill from Desmond. So. Andy, you want to say anything else or toss it to someone else? Andy, I had a really hard time hearing you. Did anyone else hear him? All of a sudden, the speaker just gave out there, Andy. I think you better log back in. He'll be back. We have charades in the meantime. One word.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully Andy can get back with us and his microphone is back to working condition. Eric Vorwald, Winooski.
Yeah, Eric Vorwald, City of Winooski, Planning and Zoning Manager. I am basically the city's representative for the project team, kind of keeping some of the city side of things in line and in touch with what we're trying to achieve.
I think we're on to the advisory committee members. Seth, you're the first one on my screen if I look down, so I'm gonna start with you, and if you want to pass the baton, please feel free.
Hi everyone, I'm Seth Leonard. I'm the Managing Director of Community Development at Vermont Housing Finance Agency. We're the primary financiers of affordable housing in the state, and a large part of development and development costs includes thinking about parking and where we build and how we build. So very interested in this conversation, and I'll pass it on to Laura DeLuclecki.
Thanks, Seth. I'm Laura, a Winooski resident, and I'm chair of the Municipal Infrastructure Commission. So we review and spend a lot of time thinking about transportation issues in the city, livable, walkable type stuff. And I will pass it on to Terry.
Hi, I'm Terry Zygmunt, Winooski resident and member of the Planning Commission. And let's see. I guess I'll pass it to Meredith.
Thanks, Terry. I'm Meredith. I'm the director of Downtown Winooski, and I'll pass it to Eric with a K.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm Eric Hoekstra. I am the managing partner at Redstone. We own and manage a bunch of property in downtown Winooski and have been actively involved with a lot of revitalization efforts and stuff along those lines. I will pass it to Christine.
Hi, Mary Christine Lott here. I'm not officially involved, but came to listen as I lead the city council and support the planning commission. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mayor Lott. I was going to acknowledge that you were here and welcome you to chime in if you'd like to. Let's go, Andy, you're back with us. I think hopefully your microphone's working.
Hopefully it is.
I can hear you.
Okay, there we go. My name is Andy Hill. I'm the Director of Consulting Services for Desmond Design Management. We're a parking consulting firm working at the direction of RSG, and looking forward to this evening's presentation.
Great.
I think that wraps it up. John, do you want to take it?
Thanks. We'll take it from here. All right. Well, so I glossed over there the agenda for the night, and I want to make sure we can try to get to the policies and management strategies that Andy's prepared some good information for all of us to consider. But first, wanted to, I guess, Mayor Lott, you are the member of the public. I want to make sure that right after we get through the agenda, if there is anything you want to say, we make sure that we give you that opportunity. But after that, then we'll jump into summaries of the parking occupancy and the data that's been collected, give you some overview summary of that, and acknowledging that we've provided you on Tuesday a much more in-depth analysis, which included a majority of charts of the parking occupancy data. And I'm happy to answer any questions, but I really don't want to dwell on that so much. I want to move into general conclusions that we can reach from that data, and so that we can move forward into the management and policies. Want to also acknowledge the survey that Jason mentioned has been widely taken within the city, and that's been wonderful to see. We analyzed it as of, I think, the 19th, and since then there's been already more survey responses, and so we'll reflect on after this meeting. We'll kind of wrap it up probably in another week and see if there's any more data that should be included in terms of the way that we take the data outputs. So I've got also some general conclusions from that survey. And then we'll spend the majority of the meeting around these policies and management strategies that we want to get your input on, as the city's in a position now to get ahead of any challenges, I think, on the parking side. And as the city looks to maybe increase certain areas of land development, also we have options to change some of the roadway configuration. We might be able to reduce some of the on-street parking supply if it means that we could get some space for other things. So we're needing to discuss some of those policies and management practices. Then we'll just talk about schedule and next steps. Any changes or updates to the agenda? Okay. Mayor Lott, is there anything that you'd like to say before we dive into the material?
No, let's jump in, but thank you.
Okay, great. So parking observations here, we have a significant amount of data, and it's really amazing. So thank you to Chris, thank you to the city of Winooski, Chris Dubin and the RPC. They've been out there collecting a lot of this data, and the city themselves through the Public Works going out there and collecting a lot of data. We have also a number of our public members of the community out there collecting data, sending it through email back to RSG, and we've been able to distill it, summarize it, put it into kind of a master database there and crunch the numbers. And so we have over 1,000, over 1,200 unique observations, and those more or less align on weekdays rather than weekends. And they cross the time horizon from some of them from about early as 6:30 in the morning to some of them about 9 at night. Then we also, and the data is from November through April, early April. And so that's the on-street observations, which really is the bulk of the data collection effort. In order to get the parking data calibrated and refresh your memory of the last meeting we had, which is really about the parking model, we also require information Eric's in there alone in the office. All the lights went off. Caught me off guard. There you go. So we also have 609 observations for private properties. And this is a complex issue because we don't want to infringe on property rights. And so we were trying to observe parking that's occurring on private property. And that is a challenge. And so I think we've done pretty well to get at least one observation on every property within the streets that we're studying. And so combining all that data, we've been able to look at the parking model and work through that. And we'll come to you next time with kind of the results and the analysis of the parking model. But today we're just to summarize the data that goes into it. In the PDF package that you received prior to this meeting, you have this slide here, which has a link to it. And it's a link that I will see if I can share my screen, see if I can scoot this over. Do you see now the map? Okay, great. This is what happens if you click on that link in the PDF, and it will be available to the general public after in PDF form after this meeting. But we have a handful of layers here on the left-hand side, and I can't zoom in, I don't think, but we have weekday PM, weekday AM, and then there are some other time slices, 7 to 9 AM, 9 AM to 3 PM, 3 PM to 8 PM. And you can click on these, and based on the darkness of the color, it shows the higher level of parking occupancy. And that means the number of spaces that are occupied by a car. And what we've done is averaged all of the counts that occur during that time period. And if you zoom out, you can kind of get a general sense. It's a little hard sometimes to see the colors, but if you zoom in, then you can see that Main Street, there are some darker colors on some of the blocks, and then lighter colors as you kind of head north here. And then you've got Weaver Street. For this particular time period, there wasn't observations. Let's do the weekday PM. We had almost everything. Weaver Street is a lighter shade of blue relative to the red on Main Street. And you can click on these things and start looking at the fields and the data that's under informing them. I'm happy to answer any questions offline. And so I know as the RPC as well as the city, if there's any questions about this data, but we want to be transparent, and this is going to be available on the website. People can click on it, look at what we have. It's all about this percentage of occupancy, is the number of spaces that are occupied on average based on the number of counts that we have. So this data is been helpful to understand where we see areas of elevated occupancy or higher occupancy. Mallett's Bay Avenue, some parts of Maine's, then we have Weaver, then Main Street, LaFountain, and then it depends on the time period. LaPointe had this block down here that was quite high for this time period on average. So it sometimes comes down to just one household parking on the street. Suddenly it just really jumps up when you don't have that many parking spaces to deal with. Any quick questions on this? I wanted to make sure you know that this exists and that you can navigate it, and just by turning off and on the layers. But I don't want to dwell on really the findings, because we have some other slides that will get there. Okay. Great. So I'm going to move that slide out of the way and move along. In the charts that you received prior to this meeting, I want to introduce this layout here, which was every chart had a street, every chart then had a segment of the street, and the bars were meant to refer to the average occupancy. And that again is that percentage of full parking spaces versus the total number of parking spaces. Unfortunately, because of just the way the Excel files were working, and we did spend some time trying to clean this up, but the number there is the number of observations that we had for that particular segment of the street. And in this case, we have 6 observations for the AM and 16 observations for the PM. And these bars represent one standard deviation off of that average. So it gives an idea of the typical range that we were experiencing in our observations. And so all those charts that you have, that is throughout the PDF that you received prior to this meeting, and I know haven't really spent some time with, but there's a lot of data there. And so it goes segment by segment throughout the whole study area. Were there any questions on that and making sure that we understand that and that you have that data? And again, that will be on the website for anybody to dive into. Yep, Seth.
I was just curious, so the charts here have just 2 time periods and the GIS map had 3. And is there any significance to that, or why the difference?
The difference was that there's a number, if you, in the 3 time periods, there are a number of 0 observations that increases. And so it made the charts a bit busier. And so in the effort to try to make the charts, which are already quite busy, to be as manageable as possible, we just did the 2 time period in the charts. And then in the GIS, it's the more full data set. But yeah, so that's the reason, but we're happy to share the Excel file, the underlying Excel file with it too. We can put that online. Okay. So some brief observations here, just a couple more slides on the observations, and then we're going to go into the survey. In the morning, this is the distribution of occupancies across all the study segments, is that by and large, the majority of findings are saying that we're less than 40% occupied across these study streets. There's a handful of streets that are above 40%, and that's what's in this table below. And you can see most of it is around Manso, Mallett's Bay, and Weaver Street. A few main streets starts to pop in there as well in the morning period, and with an average of about 27% occupied. So a quarter of the parking spaces on the street are occupied during the AM time period across the city and across these study segments. During the afternoon, we see that across the average is about the same, but there are some streets with higher occupancy. So we see some streets kind of drop, and then it just changes in focus. And that's where the GIS mapping is kind of handy to look at. And so you see it's a more even distribution with more streets kind of at the higher end than before. In the morning, it's pretty focused, is a lot higher number of lower occupancy. Again, the chart here is kind of the top 11 or top 10 streets. And we see LaFountain has that. There's a couple observations here that kind of flag for us that we want to dial into a little bit more, but it's also, I think, important here. LaFountain is one where there's maybe some Main Street overflow. Maybe there's some units there with high parking demand without a lot of on-street supply, or excuse me, off-street parking supply. But then again, Mallett's Bay Avenue, LaPointe, and Weaver and Main Street kind of raise up into these afternoon observations. So how do you feel both in the AM and the PM? I think it might be just easiest to say, are those the streets that out of what we're studying, do that kind of aligns with you, with what you understand around the city? Are these data surprising to you?
No, I wouldn't say that it's surprising to me.
Great, thanks, Laura.
I'm a little surprised by the occupancy on Main Street. Seems low.
Yeah, I think dive into the GIS, Eric, that might help visualize where that occupancy is. And again, probably closer to the main downtown core. Maybe it might be low relative to pre-pandemic levels.
I know those segments. I know those cross streets, and I'm still surprised. I know that's not the heart of downtown. It's heading, up toward Colchester, but that's still it's a mixed use corridor. It's fairly dense. I'm just surprised.
You'll see in the charts too. Yeah, the Main Street has a number of observations as well. So I felt pretty good about what we saw. Whether it's always a function of a point in time, and so that's where our general conclusions are, that we feel comfortable that this is a lot of observations. I think comparing to other parking studies and typical parking studies, you can see most of the segments in the PDF charts that I provided in advance. Most of the segments had 6 to 15 observations, and that's pretty robust from a parking occupancy data collection point of view. Is that not often do you get more than 5 observations in a segment across different time periods. It is particularly from a November to April time period. We know we're during pandemic, and we're going to discuss that in a little bit. But basically, by and large, we feel that the occupancy data, as to Laura's point, I think it generally fits with people's observations and experiences. There might be isolated differences on specific blocks. Again, just one house can really influence things. If suddenly someone moves in and they just have a few more cars and they like to park on the street rather than their driveway, that really does change the numbers, and vice versa. They could suddenly park off street. Really what we feel is this, yep.
Just with regard to numbers, I was just thinking on the previous slides, maybe for whatever we, when we put these up on the website, it might be helpful in addition to the percentages, just to show the ratio to let people know how many parking spaces there are in that given segment, just so they can see the actual numbers.
Yeah, show the parking supply numbers. Okay.
Yeah. I just kept thinking, what's the percentage of what? Percentage of how many?
Yeah. Okay, great, thanks. I think really by and large, the city is getting ahead of these issues, is that we don't have many streets where we're above that kind of magical threshold of 85% that is typically used when management and policies start to be a factor, and when we want to consider how we can start to tamp down demand. We think that there's sufficient on-street capacity to meet these current needs. And we have identified those streets with high demand, and we can start to monitor them and develop a process for the city to say what's happening over time, and to then discuss with residents on those streets to say, are we ready to discuss certain management practices? And that by and large, we have spare capacity, and that allows us to have choices. And that's a nice place to be. We can talk about then land use intensification, much to what Seth was saying, is that do we need to build the parking supply to the degree that we might have been in the past if we have capacity on the street? And I know there's other points of view of that alternatively we could use that capacity on the street to maybe shift all the parking onto one side of the street and free up that on-road space for other uses. So at this point, I feel like we have choices, which is a great place to be. All right, so a few slides on the survey, and that we had, as of the 19th, 227 complete responses, which is a good survey response for an open solicitation. And I think now it's actually closer to 250 completes, at least, if not more. By and large, most people live in Winooski. The first question here is that you can select into multiple categories. You can both work in Winooski, you can live in Winooski, you can shop and dine, you can be everything in Winooski. And so we've sliced the data a few different ways to get a handle of it. We've provided you more slides in the handout than what we're going to go through here. And we can also, once the survey gets closed, we'll send a more thorough, more full summary of the survey data out, and we'll put that on the website. One of the key questions that we're getting out of the survey, which is really nice to see that it aligns with other census data, is that we're getting an average vehicles per household number of about 1.55. That's across the survey responses today. And you can see about 42% have 1, 40% have 2. And then you've got the difference there of either 0 cars or more cars. What we like to do in surveys is to compare the survey and how it relates to census data. And we realize that the survey is oversampling those households with more cars on average. So we are undersampling. The survey has 7.3% respondents with 0 cars, and versus a census data estimate of 15%. That's common of surveys. We have hard to survey populations, particularly those maybe less than $25,000 of household income. They typically take surveys at a lower rate than higher income households. So it's expected that we do skew a little bit more toward a higher income and a more vehicle ownership population here. But I'm comfortable that even with that, we're getting a 1.55 vehicle per household number. And the census data suggests that the city of Winooski has a range of about 1.63, an average of 1.63 vehicles per household. And depending on which census tract we're in, it goes from 1.51 up to 1.79 vehicles per household average. So the survey to me says that we have some really good data coming from it. It relates with other survey and census data. And this is a good number that we'll talk about in subsequent meetings about how the parking models and how we might change policies based on the amount of vehicles that residents own.
Could I ask a question?
Yep.
I can't remember. I did take the survey, but I can't remember if you asked in there if people were renters or owners. I think you did, and I'm just curious.
Yeah, I forget.
If you broke that down anywhere here, because I notice in my neighborhood and also in other neighborhoods where I frequent that where there's more rentals, there's more vehicles. And as we're talking about eliminating parking or reducing parking in developments, that doesn't seem like it makes sense to me. So I'm just curious if there's any information about that you could share.
Okay, great. Well, I think let's look into it. I might be able to dive into the survey results and get a result when Andy's discussing some of the policies and management practices. So I'll come back to us. But what you will see, Terry, is that you don't want to make conclusions without really the data underlying it. But there was an interesting relationship here. I didn't draw the trend line, but on the vehicle ownership by income household of the households, higher incomes were shown to have a lower vehicle ownership rate. So there was this general trajectory. Now, City of Winooski, City of Burlington, we do have high income renting, so it's not directly a correlation between ownership and renting, but there is a relationship between the income and ownership of vehicles. This is data that's helping for us to work through the model again and look in the parking supply, is that the street is a smaller proportion of where people park their car. Most people do have access to a garage or driveway. It's backed up with some of the data that we observed from our parking occupancy data. On average, it was about 37% of the parking of the cars that are there were ending up on the street. LaFountain was the one oddity where we had just the reverse of that, where it had about 73% of the cars that are totally parked on the street, off street and on street. Most of them were actually on the street, which suggests that maybe they were non-residents, visitors, or maybe it's just ease of. We know some of the driveway designs being very long and skinny with only one bay width. It challenges the practical utilization of that space. A few slides here on just getting a handle on how on the occupancy data and telling us, are we having trouble parking in the city of Winooski? And that majority of the respondents are saying that we don't have a problem, 54% nearly never. We slice this by different populations here in the next slide. And that we see those who, it's a very small segment. So we talk about survey risk. Owning a business, there's only a handful of response in this survey to date. I think that population might have taken more survey responses in the last week. But based on this data, 100% of them say no problem, nearly never to park. However, those in the drop-off category, that's the orange, they have the highest, most frequently identified problems to park. And that says to me a management process might be important here to figure out where those streets are for them and to then develop a process to have greater turnover, always have a higher percentage of free spaces for those with maybe a shorter term need, like a drop-off. And then we have the other populations here of working. I live in Winooski and I shop and dine in Winooski. The majority nearly never have a problem, but we do have some occasional issues for those who live and shop and dine. And that's an economic issue, and that we want to identify where those streets are and who's having those issues. These are the streets that were most frequently identified. We have the frequent, occasional, and seldom classifications, and the streets that are not part of this study area, which is in the downtown area from the previous studies. We have the Winooski Falls Way, the West Canal Street, and the East Allen Streets. Those are the streets that are of the highest incidence, the highest frequency of being noted as having parking difficulties. So they weren't surprising to me to see those responses. The other data that aligns with our occupancy is Weaver Street and then Mallett's Bay Avenue. Surprisingly, Main Street doesn't show up as having any issues here. Either people are used to it, or there are some areas of Main Street that have higher occupancies, but it wasn't identified as having an issue.
That somewhat aligns with the data that we collected, right? With the low occupancy.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to have two sources of data that back each other up, and they're from different points of view. So, yep. We comfortable to move on from this one? Okay, great.
Jonathan, actually, one quick question on that. Because a lot of the issues with parking are related to roads in the downtown, does that have any impact on the other parts of the survey data, or are you able to kind of pull those responses out and analyze everything else, or the other responses in the areas that are not downtown specific?
I feel pretty good about this question being pretty isolated, is that we do ask, do you have problems parking? That's the question. It's unrelated to their vehicle ownership. It's unrelated to, do they live or work in the city? We could start to pull away different responses based on this, but I don't think this in itself, I think, is a nice conclusion that we can, or at least a finding out of the survey, and it doesn't affect any of the other bigger conclusions that we can use or draw from it. Some other pieces that I think are fascinating here, that there was a lot of questions in the survey, and I think it will provide the city value in the future for various reasons. But in this one, in terms of an employed person, this is helpful to understand that while we know that the pandemic has shifted employment patterns, by and large, people weren't parking on the street. And that is a helpful data point that we can draw. And that's why I think we have better comfort on some of the occupancy data on some of the streets, that by and large, people who were employed were parking in dedicated lots or in publicly available parking lots that we weren't studying as part of this study. Some slides. And
just out of curiosity,
yep.
how can you extrapolate this for when it's not the pandemic? Because if all this data was collected during the pandemic when people were working from home predominantly, how can you, I just don't understand how this could be valid.
We'll get there. We'll have
Okay.
a little section on the COVID impacts. So on the shopping and parking, again, I think this is a population that's really important for Winooski to consider. How do we shop and dine and do the economic activities? And by and large, people who shopping and dining do park on the street. So it's the flip side of those who are employed. And we know that they're not really showing up in the magnitude that they once were. And what's also curious, though, is that they do majorly pay for parking when they do come. So we know, though, if that's the case, they park in only certain areas of the city. So that was a nice snapshot of what behavior they typically do if you're in a shop and dine in the city. One would assume that you would also park close to where you want to go. So if you're not paying for parking, you're going to be parking on some of those other streets that might be affecting some of the residential streets nearby, and some of the Main Street corridors and the Mallett's Bays and other things. So again, this is some data that's just helpful, and I wanted to convey that here. It doesn't really direct us explicitly, but it's more of the bigger philosophy that will go into the management practices. So Terry, to your point here, let's see if I can get rid of that menu up top. I don't know. The COVID effects, we do have a number of slides in the PDF that was emailed to you in advance. And that goes into a little bit more detail, both in terms of the survey responses saying who has changed their behavior, both from a residential point of view and an employment point of view. And it also then goes into more detail into an observation that was made on Weaver Street pre-pandemic versus the current occupancy data that was collected. So distilling those two sources of data, we have the survey data first. And it really correlates well with RSG's observations that we've been doing a national COVID panel survey that shows that working from home maxed out at about 30% of employees. The majority of people employed in the city of Winooski is about over 50%. They did not work from home. There is a population that live and work in the city, but those who just work in the city that do not live in the city, they were less affected by the pandemic. Those who live and work in the city, or those who just live in the city, about 30% of those were working from home at the peak, and that they were changing their behavior. The top line number there is that 52% of residents in the city saw some degree of increased parking demand. That means they are working from home either part-time or full-time. And that was changing the nature of parking during the day, but it was only a small portion that working from home full-time. At the end of the day, they own the vehicles the same. They need the same amount of parking at night or at the end of the day. So when we were looking at their parking occupancy, particularly during the PM peak, people would most likely either be coming home or at home. So we were feeling comfortable that the observations we had were not completely influenced by the pandemic for the residents. The employee side for a minute is that 36% of employees who don't live in Winooski are remote. But we also know, so that would be an impact. And so we are concerned then by the occupancy, and what we're looking at is that some of the people aren't showing up. However, only 20% of those people park on the street. So we're talking about a smaller subset of people who were missing out of our occupancy counts. Majority of the employees park in areas that we're not counting them, basically. The business owners, I was rather surprised, but I'm hoping that with more survey response, we'll get more confidence on this one. But that 5 out of 7 responses say either no change or very slight decrease in parking demand. So it wasn't as significant as I would have expected. That is something that we'll want to monitor and see whether new survey data either enhances that or reinforces that conclusion. 58%, so I'm combining full-time and part-time working from home or working remotely, is that there is some degree of reduced parking demand. And so I think the Main Street corridor, some of the other employment areas would have a lower occupancy. So much to Eric's concern about Main Street, I think we might be missing some occupancy there. But the reality is that we don't know when that data is going to come back to normal. The other side, because most of the streets that we're surveying are nearly homogeneous residential in nature, we have a much more, I think, confident on the data and that it is applicable and it is useful during this pandemic period. The Weaver Street, which is a one-off example, but it does give us some confidence that it's saying that the pandemic saw in one direction, it was slightly higher by 10% occupancy, 2% during the afternoon. In the northbound direction, it was 4% versus 8%. Not significant numbers. When you're looking at the occupancy data that we saw, a 10% change in occupancy is just a few parking spaces. And again, that's just a few cars. I think it's 6 cars in that 10% number across 100 something spaces. So it's not, I guess, no, 60%, 60 spaces, I guess. So the occupancy numbers there between the Weaver Street and pre-pandemic and pandemic give us the confidence to conclude that for our purposes here and moving forward for the city, given that we're predominantly residential, we should be able to proceed with confidence that we're giving the city valid data and that we should talk about planning for the future, using the parking model, using the parking data so that we can look at how we can advise the city going forward with policies and management practices to manage problems if they may emerge in the future. So Terry, does that at all address your concern? Are you not convinced?
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to get back here. I'm not 100% convinced, but it sounds like you guys have it. You've looked at it from a couple of different ways. So, yeah. I mean, I'm still concerned, like I said, because I just wonder what's going to happen when things get back to normal, you know?
Yeah, we'll be sharing other data as it comes available from other points of view. We have a big study in Massachusetts right now that's all about a teleworking, and the data is coming back, and it's going to be a new normal, the reality.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to start from somewhere, and we have a good baseline here that I think because we're majority residential, I feel that we're in a pretty good spot. Main Street is probably one of the areas that's going to require some monitoring and say there's a baseline here and it's going to change in the future. And I don't think frankly, a pre-pandemic would be all that valuable anyway.
Thanks.
Andy, I'm sure you have, Jason, sorry. I was just going to say to Andy, his observations from a point of view of parking council and Desmond, who does parking every day. I would appreciate any other, insights and observations. But
I mean, in terms of trending, what we're seeing in the short term and what we're sort of anticipating from now to the end of this current calendar year is that we're going to start to see a slow return into office and a slow, I wouldn't even call it an erosion, but a reduction in absences associated with telework. What we expect a large wave hitting most urban centers right after September 1st. There's nothing scientific behind this projection. We just know anecdotally and also from partnering with some other firms. We've been working in the background with PricewaterhouseCoopers, who's been doing ongoing surveys of the impact of remote working here. That a lot of the resistance to returning to the office and leaving the domicile heretofore has been about communication. It's going to very quickly become, as you start to see wider vaccination and herd immunity, it's going to become more and more about childcare. And I don't think it's any surprise that the president is speaking tonight, and one of the things he's speaking about is childcare mandates, because that has always been a challenge to working families here. So the anticipation is with the resumption of school as an in-person entity here, you're going to see a lot less resistance to folks coming back to the office. That said, I'm sitting in the middle of a city right now that last time I heard was averaging about 20% occupancy of Class A office space. And we're talking several million square feet here. By September, we think that that's going to be coming in at somewhere around 60 to 65. Over the next couple of years, what we expect it to do is roller coaster a little bit. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, you may see those occupancy rates climb up to 80 to 85% in some cases, depending on the time of year. Whereas Mondays and Fridays, it may be closer to that 60% rate or even lower during the summer, because a lot of people will have used this opportunity to demonstrate remote work works, and they'll be working off a hybrid model. Best estimate right now is we're probably 3 to 5 years out from complete stabilization, and even at stabilization, based on the composition of workers across different industries across the US, we think that demand driven by employees is probably going to come in at 20 to 25% lower than what you saw at pre-pandemic levels. And that's because of the concentration of folks who are in fire services and tech services, which seem to be the biggest adopters of remote work or hybrid work solutions. Those folks will remain permanent. Everybody else, we really expect to some degree to kind of come back and stabilize, like I said, 3 to 5 years out. In the interim, you'll start to see slow return. And it will probably be influenced primarily by seasonal aspects here. Higher occupancy rates during the cold winter months and non-vacation periods, lower during the summer and when the weather's more pleasant. That's about all I've got for you right now. Give me another 6 months and I might have hard numbers. And if they're really reliable, I'm going to quit this job and go play the market.
Great. Jason, were you going to hop in there?
Oh, sorry.
I was.
I'll go after you. I just have a quick question.
Okay, thanks, Meredith. I was just gonna, I think, piggyback on what you had said, John, in that I feel comfortable enough that we have a good baseline. And after listening to Andy, it sounds, you know, things are dynamic. We don't really know what's going to happen, but nonetheless, I think we're in a good position. And like any tool, you know, we're going to need to update this as time goes on in the future and things, you know, return back to normal. So we'll, you know, we're gonna, as the CCRPC, you know, we'll be, you know, ready and willing to work with the city to, you know, do some more counts, you know, in the future. Hopefully next time around with the help of interns, that would be appreciated personally.
Meredith, were you going to jump in there?
Yeah, I just had a quick question regarding that second point where it said 36% of employees who don't live in Winooski are working remote, and I'm assuming that there are similar. I don't know what the numbers are for people who live in Winooski. Like I'm sure they're, you know, similar or a little bit higher. And then, however, only 20% typically park on the street. So I guess my question was, and this is my assumption, I just wanted to know if this is on the right track. Of those people who are typically working remotely, whether they live in Winooski or not, it's my assumption anecdotally that a lot of the people that are currently working remote, that when they are in Winooski and working in their office spaces, especially the large capacity offices, they're parking in a private parking lot. Is that like supported by data?
Yeah, so let's break that down.
Okay.
The majority of people who work in Winooski, 80% of them are parking in a lot or a garage. So that holds full stop. Those are people who are employed in Winooski. There are a number of people, I think it's 69 respondents that both live and work in Winooski. And there are a number of those that park at home during the day instead of at a place of employment. But this number that we're talking about here are those who don't live in Winooski. 36% of them have some degree of working remotely. I think it's about 24% or so full-time, with then the difference being some part-time. The point of that one is that those people who work in Winooski, only 20% of them park on the street. And the percentage of employees who don't live in the city who are working remotely is smaller than the people who the people who live and work in Winooski. Those people telework more. So the people who just work in Winooski, they are more they're more common to be at work physically more often. But more of them are parking on the street, or excuse me, 20% of them. So I feel like we've captured them because they were at work during this whole pandemic. We've captured that audience pretty well, the people who have to be at work in Winooski. So sorry, I've had to look at this from so many angles, and I apologize if I'm confused. And the charts that you have, the PDF that you have prior to this meeting, there are some charts that try to isolate those different populations with some of those numbers. So maybe that will make sense too. And I'm also happy to do a screen share off this call and to look at some of those results if that's of interest.
Yeah, I was just sort of trying to dig into the facts of sort of on Terry's question and all of our question about like the relevancy of this post-pandemic. And so I was sort of trying to think that it would be really relevant because it was my assumption that those people that are working remotely wouldn't be parking on the street anyway. So they wouldn't be captured by this observation anyway, even if they were in the office. So that was sort of what I was, the track that I was on. So, okay, cool.
So I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, and then actually just a little more about that, just thinking about the downtown and the people that work downtown, especially people that work like in the Rotary, all those restaurants that are, you know, kind of skeleton crews right now. Where are those folks parking normally? Because I'm sure that there, you know, there's far fewer employees downtown right now, and those people will not be working remotely, are not working remotely now, and wouldn't be working remotely going forward.
Right. Yeah, and we don't have a good number on the absolute numbers of employees that we're talking about. We have the number of respondents, and we know what general industry they fall in. So I don't know if that was in the chart in the pre-meeting materials, but we show that it was a good diversity of different industries and job type, which Andy kind of mentioned. It does correlate with income often. But their work that RSG has done is that there's 3 general categories that a lot of the job types fall under. And there's kind of the professional realm, and those by and large were remote and still are majority. Then there's kind of this mixed hybrid, which it was about going to work middle range. And then there was always an on-site crew. And the sectors in Winooski, there is a mix, but there is still there's a larger share of those on the site jobs. You need to be there for manufacturing, you need to be there for certain aspects. So that's why I think the survey data supports that majority of the people who are working in Winooski are actually showing up to work during this pandemic.
So, Jonathan, I had a question about a piece of data you had on one of your first slides, or an earlier slide, and this may be starting to transition into the next agenda item. So if it is, feel free to stop me and we can cover it then. But you'd mentioned that we're basically at around 85% occupancy or so for the available parking and what we have. And I guess I was curious if there's any information or any guidance on at what point you can add alternatives to those streets and then accommodate a larger percentage of occupancy because you have these alternative facilities. And I guess what I'm kind of thinking about is, you know, to the points that have been raised so far with Main Street and the fact that it seems low. You know, we're going to be going through, we have a full plan to redevelop Main Street, which will reduce some of the on-street parking, but it's going to increase the alternatives, either through wider sidewalks or through dedicated bike facilities. So is there any data that shows that you can add alternative facilities to these roadways and at the same time support an increased occupancy of your available parking?
So let's break that down again, is that the occupancy across the city, it's about 75% free right now on average, but that's across every street. And clearly you don't want to think in things of aggregate nature, because someone working on Main Street is not going to park their car on La Pointe and walk. right? That's a little bit too far, most likely. So we do have to think about things in a more segment by segment, street by street nature. And there are streets that have elevated levels that are approaching that 85% number that you mentioned is when, and this will, when we'll shift it to Andy here, but that's the number, that's kind of the magical number that have been used to say, we need to start managing it to get a turnover so that you can always find at least a couple, 1 or 2 spaces on your block so that you don't just keep circling the block to find parking. So that's what that 85% number. There are a few streets that are approaching that during certain times of the day. And that's where we need to start the management process. And yes, there are some data that do show that areas of the city that have high transit or better transit uses, as well as more walkable and bikeable facilities, they tend to have fewer vehicles per household. So that's where the data holds that it's all about ownership. If you just happen to commute by bike, but you happen to own a car, you still need space for it. And the data does support that those areas with higher transit and walkable neighborhoods typically own cars a little bit lower. So that's where the data will eventually come forward, but that's more of a longer policy initiative. And it's something that over time you say, if we're going to invest in transit and we're going to invest in these facilities, then we can continue to dial down that ownership number and reduce the number of parking spaces that we need over time. But it's not going to be a magic change to say, put in the bike lane, and then immediately all the cars are going to go away. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Andy here, and we have a few slides, and I think, Andy, it's probably just the easiest for me just to flick through for you.
Yeah, before we dive in, I actually want to circle back to Eric's question because I thought it was a very good one. And it's one that we hear from a lot of our municipal clients. If we do this, if we do that, if we provide these additional services and supports to promote alternative modes of transportation, will we see a commensurate reduction in demand? And we like to talk in terms of both carrots and sticks. All of those improvements that you're talking about, wider sidewalks, dedicated bike lanes, certainly go a long way to making those more enticing. But if you don't have a equivalent stick to apply when you get those as well, you won't actually get the modal shift that you're looking for. And most often, the most effective stick that's available to municipalities is manipulating pricing for parking. The second most effective and available stick that's available to them is constraining the production of additional supply or basically fixing supply and letting demand start to overlap that, creating additional competition. Those things will get the conversion that you're looking for. So the simple answer to your question is, yeah, it'll get you halfway, and then we need to talk about what else you need to do to get you the rest of the way so that there's an actual return on the investment you're making. So that being said, kind of our initial objectives with this first pass were to take a look at the codes, regulations, policies that are currently in place with regards to parking in Winooski. Benchmark those against some comparable communities to see where you stack up relative to some other communities that have similar dynamics, and then also talk a little bit about what industry best practices are for some of these things, which is specific to parking, but also talks about bicycle parking, promotion of alternative modes of transportation, because these things all kind of go hand in glove when we talk about these things. Now, can we go to the next slide, please? So in terms of looking at a comparable set, you're a little bit of a challenge, Winooski, here, because you've got a density, a population density that's head and shoulders above every other municipality in the state of Vermont here. In fact, your closest competitor is Burlington, And it's not really that close as far as it goes. One of the reasons we focus on population density is because that tends to drive competition for available parking, which then creates parking issues. So one of the benchmarks we wanted to look at was population density, and we wanted to look at, basically we tried to focus on the two municipalities that we thought for the closest comparison to Winooski, those would be Burlington, primarily because it's right across the river, and then Rutland, which is about twice the population, but about half the density here. We also took a look at Brattleboro, Middlebury, and Montpelier, not because they've got real comparable density, but because they've got similar populations and some similar dynamics here. All of them being communities where you've got a riverfront running through them, fairly constrained footprints in the downtown, and a downtown and surrounding area that serve as a destination to some of the smaller, more outlying areas in and around there. It's a fairly big spread on median income. It was about 60% from the highest to the lowest. With property values, an even bigger spread. Self-driving rates was about a 45% swing between the highest and lowest. Interestingly enough, though, the average number of cars per household per the American Community Survey was fairly closely aligned, with the exception of Brattleboro. And I don't have any logic to describe that, because you would anticipate with a lower number of cars per household, you would have a lower driving rate, but they're about middle of the pack as far as this goes. But this became the initial comparable set that we looked at here. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the first thing we took a look at is just parking management structure, and really asked our questions. In each one of these communities, who's the management agency for parking? Who's providing enforcement? Roughly how big is the system? How many garages? How many lots? Do they have on-street meters? What's the rate for parking per hour on-street versus off-street? What are they charging for a pass? In terms of the size of the system, Winooski is comparable to Montpelier, Rutland, and Brattleboro. Burlington and Middlebury is much smaller. Burlington is clearly much larger in terms of total capacity. Pretty much all of the communities out there are having either DPW or police really have oversight over the management, and then police doing enforcement, with the exception of Burlington. Burlington recently brought enforcement in-house. Their idea was they wanted to take it away from the police and put it under their parking department, which is part of DPW. And the idea was creating sort of a one-stop shop as far as that goes. This is considered within municipal circles as sort of a parking industry best practice, because it creates one centralized agency that's handling all things parking. The next step beyond that is within that agency also starting to create a position that coordinates transportation and mobility services as well. So that you have one place somebody can go to get all the information they need about how to get in and out of town, and where you can rest your vehicle while you're there if you want to, or what your other alternatives are to driving in and out. In terms of pricing, Winooski prices on-street and off-street parking roughly the same. It's a universal parking rate structure on a per hour basis here. That runs a little counter to conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom says curbside parking is the most valuable parking. It is the parking that you're going to see the greatest competition for. And it is a parking that most often you want available for your discretionary parkers that are coming in, your transits, your shoppers, your patrons, your diners. In order to have it available, typically what you want to do is price that higher than the same length of stay in an off-street facility. The idea being that you're creating a price incentive for longer term parkers, employees and residents. to take advantage of those off-street facilities. One of the reasons you want those folks in there and not curbside is because they are more familiar with the area. And they have the ability to comfortably pilot from an off-street facility to a destination. Whereas a lot of your infrequent visitors generally will find a location they're looking for in the digital age. They find it on their smartphone, punch it into their GPS, drive to that destination, then start circling the block looking for available parking. In a perfect world, we would love to have a parking space open and available to them right at the curb. But the way that you're going to be able to do that most effectively is to create a pricing structure that makes that turnover and that availability possible here. That structure is most often one where you're putting a premium on the curbside space and you're offering a discount for those folks who are willing to go off the street as far as it goes. Burlington and Rutland, Rutland are a couple of interesting stories here. Brattleboro is kind of already doing that. Montpelier is doing that. Middlebury we just threw out because they don't charge for parking. Burlington has instituted a 3 different tier pricing structure for their on-street parking. In the 10-hour meters, which are the furthest from downtown, you can actually park for about 40 cents an hour for up to 10 hours. As you get closer to downtown, it's $1 an hour. But there's usually a 2 or 3 hour time limit as far as that goes. And then right in the downtown core, they've set their meters at $1.50 an hour, but there's no time limit as far as that goes. And the idea behind that is that pricing will create the regulation that a time limit in ticketing might otherwise provide here. Contrast that with their off-street policy, which is in one garage, the Church Street garage, they are actually charging $1 an hour right out of the gate. But the other 2 garages are actually free parking for the first 2 hours. And then it is, I believe the rate structure starts at $1 on the 3rd hour and increases by $1 per hour thereafter. Rutland looks like they actually got it backwards until you start looking at the policies behind it. And what you find out is they have a very limited length of stay for any type of on-street meter. So while it's 50 cents an hour, which is cheaper than parking in the lots of the garages here, a maximum length of stay is 2 hours, and there is fairly vigorous enforcement and fairly stiff penalties for violating that. Inversely, with the off-street garage that they've got, it is $1 an hour, but it's $1 it's actually free for the first 30 minutes, $1 for 31 minutes to 60 minutes, another $1 for the 2nd hour. And by the time you roll into the 3rd hour, you're now looking at a flat rate that's good for the next 24 hours. On nights and weekends and holidays, when there's no competition at all, they just go to a straight $2 an hour flat rate as far as that goes. So the pricing structure is inverted, but the policies make that system work as far as it goes. Winooski does offer some passes in their parking garage. However, none of those are publicly available. Those are typically conveyed over to institutional user groups. So there's an NA on there because there's nothing comparable as far as it goes. Everybody else offers some degree of pass for off-street parking as well. Before I move on, any questions about this? Great, let's go to the next slide. One of the things that we want to spend some time looking at was residential parking permit programs. Those seem to be most germane to the area that we're looking at and studying right now. A little bit of background on residential parking permit programs, or RPPs. Very often these are initially instituted to create a barrier to keep folks from commercial districts, keep them from fleeing into residential areas, very often because either they're trying to avoid time limits and parking tickets, or they're trying to avoid paying for parking at all. That is usually why these things typically get created. There are a number of different ways how these can be created. In Winooski, the city manager actually designates residential parking permit zones in collaboration with council and professional staff and the community members. It's not very clear right now, based on regulations and the other literatures out there, how this process happens. I would imagine it probably starts with a well-placed comment or complaint into a representative's ear that gets the ball rolling to investigate the issue and establish the RPP as far as that goes. Best practice, which has evolved over the last decade or so, holds that ideally what you would like to do is have the general public petition for creation. And the reason that you usually have them do this is because there is usually a threshold for demonstrating majority support for something like this. So it creates a situation where you are at least assured that if you are moving forward with RPP, you have majority support behind it. And it also creates an automatic channel for communication during the creation and establishment process here. In Winooski, every resident can qualify for a permit if they meet the criteria. This is a little different from a lot of communities that usually base it on household as far as it goes. You are allotted 2 guest parking passes. And there are a number of different exceptions for contractors, vendors, and other visitors that are coming into this area that will allow them to park at the curb and not be subject to ticketing. The credential is a bumper sticker, if I'm not mistaken, and there's no cost associated with this program. This is in contrast to what Burlington's doing, which is they start with a petition process where I believe they've got to demonstrate 70% support within the proposed zone before the city will consider going forward with creation of an RPP. The limit is, I believe, 4 per household. They do get 2 guest parking passes. There are a series of exceptions. I think they go with a window sticker, and there is an annual permit cost as well. Rutland, Brattleboro, Middlebury have not encountered this issue yet and have not established anything. Montpelier has about a dozen RPPs on the books, but no information whatsoever available on how they were created, how they're administered, if there's a cost associated with them. In talking about terms of best practices, as a general rule, the programs that are most successful, like I said, start with a petition process. And then when it comes to deciding the number of residential permits and regulating guest parking passes, it really comes down to what's your objective. And I'll give you some very clear examples here. In the city of Boston, you can get a residential parking permit by meeting criteria and paying a very nominal fee in order to get the sticker on your car. That is a calculated political decision on the part of the city because the last time I checked, there were roughly 8 cars for every possible curbside space in every residential parking area across the city. So there is no attempt whatsoever for any type of balance in supply and demand. This is strictly a political move, and it actually is fairly effective for driving people to other forms of transportation without necessarily blaming the city for the lack of supply and demand balance here. Basically, you're buying a gambling or hunting license to go looking for an available space. If you get one, never move your car again. Although I believe they make you move your car every 24 hours within these spaces. It's always fun to go out about 3 o'clock in the morning and watch folks doing the shuffle in the north end or the south end or some of the other adjacent neighborhoods here. They're in an interesting contrast to another community, Fort Collins, Colorado, which actually, once they get an application in for establishing an RPP, go out and do an extensive study of the number of spaces that are available within the area. And then on that basis, go back to the community that's petitioning for this and say, based on what our understanding is for the number of available spaces in the area, you can have 1 permit per household, or if the capacity will allow 2 permits per household. But they are really focused on balancing supply and demand. To that end, Fort Collins also has a progressive rate structure. So I believe your first permit in Fort Collins is $25. Your second permit is $50. And if you're allowed more than that, the price doubles again and again for each additional permit. The idea being they don't necessarily want to make them unavailable to folks, but they want to make it very unattractive to somebody who's looking to clear out their garage so they can turn it into a studio for their kid who's an aspiring rock star and park 4 cars out on the street. They want to put an opportunity cost associated with that, which is why they create that structure. One of the other best practices with permits here is, and I don't think it's as big a concern in Winooski right now, but in some other communities as these programs grow and evolve, especially if there is a limit per user or per household, you'll start to see abuses with the guest permit system here, where somebody will want a 3rd permit, not be able to qualify it, and instead will use this guest permit and park under this guest permit. As a result, one of the things we recommend is if not right away when you're establishing your program, at some point down the line, when you've had a chance to audit a little bit, you may want to look at putting either a time limit or X number of uses into effect per permit so that you don't get that same type of abuse as far as that goes. It's just another way to make sure that the program works as designed and that folks are not necessarily getting a workaround as far as that goes. The last thing to keep in mind, and it may not necessarily be germane within this study area with the exception of Main Street, but it will get there eventually as Winooski continues to grow. RPPs can, in point of fact, exist with other parking regulations to support commercial uses. Typically, the workaround that you see for this is an RPP that gets established but allows for length of stay of up to 2 hours without a permit during daylight hours along those lines, or an RPP that is mixed with small meter zones on each block or metering across the entire area as far as that goes, which the residents may very well be subject to as well during daytime business hours if the competition for curbside parking is that fierce.
Andy, I was just gonna jump in there on the little sensitive. We took so long on some of the other stuff there, unfortunately, but we have some other slides here. Can we summarize a few more slides and then see if we can get to? There was one slide that particularly at the end where you have some of these conclusions that it'd be nice to bounce them off to some people.
Yep. Sorry about that, folks. Parking geek got carried away here. In terms of enforcement mechanisms, you're right in line with the other communities here. These all appear to be fairly effective, and if not in the median, then at the top percentile relative to what's being imposed by some of these other communities. The one area I am going to recommend revisiting is the fine associated with exceeding posted time limits. Just because I think you need to measure how effective that is relative, and I'm thinking specifically of metering, relative to overstaying at a meter here. You want to make sure that the fine is prohibitive, but not necessarily abusive. So getting into parking requirements, we talked a little bit about management. Now let's talk about provision here. Some things that initially jumped out, and if I got these wrong, please someone step in and correct me here. But as I read through Winooski's land use codes here, one of the things that jumped out to me initially was Winooski has a minimum reserved parking requirement. And while it's not explicitly stated there, the term reserved typically implies that the parking that is allocated to support that particular use cannot be used by any other outside user. I'm not sure if that's how it's administered, but I will tell you that if that is the way it is administered, you're potentially doing yourself a little bit of a disservice, because very often there will be capacity associated with various projects that can be shared with other projects. And that reservation requirement will cut off that opportunity to make the most use of the infrastructure you're creating. The other one that was a little curious was the code asks for projections by user type and land use. It gives requirements by land use. It does not break them out between patients and visitors. You may want to look at, if that's going to remain on the books, look at either revising your requirements or pulling that one off the books, because right now there's no mechanism for an applicant to actually suss out how much of a 3.0 per thousand is in retail or commercial uses is associated with employees versus visitors, other than going to another resource or making a best estimate as far as it goes. The other thing that I'll tell you, and this is just my professional opinion, but point of concern was the commercial uses. Most other communities make some sort of distinction between density of demand and impact of demand for retail, restaurant, and other commercial uses like health clubs. There is sort of a one size fits all ratio associated with those in the Winooski code right now. And it's a little concerning, because I will tell you, ULI and ITE can put parking demand associated with retail as high as 4.5, but with restaurant as high as 20 per thousand. It's a little bit concerning if these ratios are coming in lower than some of those industry standards. Now, that said, I also have to acknowledge that very often when code is set, it is set to achieve some larger objective than just making sure there's enough parking. There are a number of communities that are flirting with the idea of doing away with parking requirements altogether and allowing developers to set their own parking requirements as far as it goes. It's fine, you can definitely do that. It's been very effective as an approach, especially if you're trying to promote alternative modes of transportation, because folks will build to the bare minimum and make the most use of what's available, creating competition for available parking and making alternative modes look more attractive. But if that's your objective, be aware that there will be political fallout from that. Ultimately, there are communities that set very low parking requirements because the community is ready to bear the cost of that. And they will pour the concrete that they need in order to make sure there's adequate capacity. If that's your objective, that's great. Don't touch anything. If it's not your objective, it may bear revisiting some of these ratios again. By the way, you're still yards and miles ahead of Rutland. Rutland does not have any parking requirements on their books. When you read through their regulations, they actually defer to ULI shared parking, which is a great resource as far as base demand ratios, but the one they're using is from 1983, and that has gone through 2 different editions since then and been updated both times.
Andy, can we chat about, this one? I know everyone, I'm going to ask for your willingness to go 10 minutes over here, if that's possible, because I want to get through. Andy, you'd have 2 minutes on this one, and then there's a number of recommendations, and want to get your sense of any of these things that we should explore for the next meeting.
So just real quickly here, Winooski has, in addition to these parking requirements, they have a whole host of different mechanisms that will allow for some sort of reduction or variance or waiver on parking requirements here. And kudos to you for being one of only 2 communities that actually includes bicycle parking requirements as part of your code. The one thing that sort of jumped out at me when I was looking at these different allowances is there is something on the books which states that an applicant, in collaboration with the Department of Public Works, can actually get an allowance for the amount of public parking available in the area to meet transient land use needs. Those would be shoppers, patrons, something like that. This is on the surface a very smart policy that could come back and haunt you. And the example that I like to give is city of Richmond, Virginia has an old industrial neighborhood right in the middle of it that had lots and lots and lots of available curbside parking. They instituted something like this as part of their permitting process. In the first 10 projects that came through, took off like gangbusters, and the area started to really grow and evolve very rapidly. And then that 11th project came in, and they went to execute this, and suddenly the city realized that they could not honor this variance anymore. And unfortunately, the area was starting to become very popular, and there was some litigation that arose from it. So be very careful when you're allowing the pledge of public parking to meet any type of need mandated by code. Even when it's cleverly written, it is possible to still have folks accuse you of basically using a public asset to promote the development of a private property. So I came out with a series of sort of 11 recommendations based on this initial review. Very quickly, just going through these, carry over from the 2016 study. City should consider the creation of a mobility manager position within city government to sort of work as a champion for all things parking, transportation, and mobility. Single source resource to the community, to developers, et cetera, to continue to evolve and manage those programs pushing forward. Would suggest looking at pricing curbside parking at a higher premium. And as you start to see evolution in your different neighborhoods, especially when you're starting to see a change in some of the different commercial uses that might be mixed in residential, revisiting your hours of enforcement, making sure that that keeps up with the prime periods of demand and need. I would recommend taking another look at your RPP program and starting to think about introducing language which will allow residents to actually initiate the creation of zones. And if the idea is that you really want to provide this as a supplement or benefit to residents in the area, create some sort of study component in that program to take a look at what the availability is of parking relative to the number of participants, and make sure that there's some sort of balance before you ratify any type of new RPP. Also, we talked a little bit about potentially putting some sort of limitation on guest permits at some point to prevent any type of abuse in the future. A lot of communities now are going away from the sticker system and adopting the LPR as license plate recognition as an enforcement tool, which means you can now use your plates for virtual permits, which gives the system a lot more flexibility here. We talked about an escalating rate structure for RPPs if you're not going to put a limit on the number per household. raising the rhyme for overtime parking, looking at revising parking requirements to recognize greater nuance in land uses. Don't allow credits or waiver against requirements for on-street public parking. One thing I didn't talk about, but Montpelier is doing right now, and interestingly, Burlington is doing, but for the wrong kind of parking, is institution of an in lieu fee waiver, which would allow developers who are coming in and don't or can't meet the minimum parking requirement for the site to buy waivers that go into a general fund that's then used to support parking and transportation programs administered by the city. Montpelier does this right now against their vehicular parking requirements. Burlington has this on their books, but interestingly, it's just for their bike parking requirements. It doesn't apply to cars.
So thank you, Andy. We've covered a lot of ground there tonight, both from the data that we've shared before the meeting. I think the confidence that we have data that's during the pandemic, that's a value here. We have a number of streets in the residential context that is that's below a management threshold, yet we have areas that are going to start seeing some tension as growth happens, but we have some options. Part of the next phase of this project is to build in how the Main Street effects will change parking on Main Street. So with the change in parking supply and maybe some new land use intensity. So we're going to be working with a travel model to say, this is how you are in this baseline. This is where you might look in the future. And so we're going to be talking about these recommendations that Andy has brought up here to say which ones might be most appropriate for different parts of the city. We have some parts of the downtown core that's maybe more appropriate to really optimize the pricing, but should pricing grow in terms of where it's utilized elsewhere in the city? The residential parking permit process, is that something that we want to investigate further, develop a little bit more? Andy already has some recommendations here for Winooski. What would be your initial, I apologize, it's very late in the evening now on this, but we wanted to get a lot of this material in front of you. And, off the cuff right now, what's your general reaction? Are there other management practices that you feel that would be appropriate to consider? Are there any things that we missed here? And what's your general sense of maybe a residential parking permit? Seems to be really the way, Andy, you've kind of narrowed down the pathway, saying that's probably the most appropriate for these residential streets.
Just is the city data on the number of violations written and meter utilization available? Is that charted and graphed over time? And was that analyzed?
Not by us not in this study right now, but we might be able to look into that.
No, this was a first high level take. Like I said, 10,000 foot take, looking at best practices, et cetera. The next pass on this is going to have to dig into some of that data and see what that tells us about how critical these issues are.
I guess what I'm struggling with is we just saw slides and presentations earlier that seem to lead towards the idea that there are some areas of challenge and difficulty, but we haven't seen enforcement information and data to know how often people are actually violating something, and now are discussing the idea of putting in restrictive measures. Does that make sense? Like, we're jumping kind of to enforcement, and it feels like missing a step, going from here's some data that seems to lead us to the idea that there is enough available inventory, to talking about kind of drastic changes to the way the enforcement's done. I guess I'm missing a jump there.
Well, and what we're really missing is a timeline on these things too. None of these are recommendations for tomorrow. One of the things I need to let Jonathan do is his work a little bit to project forward when issues are going to arise going forward, and that will help determine which, what order of things need to happen and what's the timing on each one of these. These are all reasonable conditions to put in place when those conditions merit. Right now, you're absolutely right. There's no issue, so there's not the necessity to institute any of these things. Now, that said, some of this stuff takes some time to evolve and create, and it doesn't necessarily mean you can't start working on some of these programs without implementing them next week.
Yeah, and what one piece of this, Seth, is that if the city were to say this street has excess capacity or spare capacity, and it's where, let's just say we want to shift all the parking on one side from both sides of the road to one side of the road only. We now have the mechanism to say that's going to increase the demand now, and now we've got to manage it. So we're trying to give the tools at the same time as giving flexibility.
Something I think I'd be interested to see on this list is potential for expansion of our enforcement areas. I think right now it's primarily just focused in the downtown core and to the residential areas, where it may be something that could help with some of the turnover, at least if, for example, we expand enforcement up Main Street. That may have some greater impacts, but I think once we look at a Main Street revitalization and we reduce the potential number of spaces for on-street parking, it may be more important to try to get those to turn over more. Because I know right now, basically, I think it's above the railroad tracks. Everything north of that is just open parking for the most part, or maybe it's a little further north, but it's most of Main Street is not enforced at all. So there's, we're seeing a lot more just idle vehicles parked all day long. So I'd be interested to see how that could play into this list of recommendations as well.
Absolutely, we can work on that, and hand in glove with that. If we're going to start instituting time zones and doing vigorous enforcement up and down Main Street, we also need to think about what we're doing on the side streets abutting Main Street, because that's where people will flee.
Right, exactly.
So I'm going to look to try to close this up. I really appreciate everyone's patience again, as we've kind of exceeded this meeting timeline. I apologize,
Hey,
but we
John,
covered a
before
lot.
that,
Yeah.
Before you go ahead, I think Mayor Lott had her hand raised. I don't know if she wanted
Oh,
to.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
I just wanted to second what Eric said about enforcement. Also, where would adding striping and forcing people to park more efficiently help? This list seems really focused on residential permits, and to me that doesn't connect to the streets where we're actually seeing the problem. That this, similar to what Seth said, this is like a step beyond what we need to address in the moment or in the near term. I also don't know if this was the intent of your work, but connecting this to the parking requirements that we are regulating, I don't see any recommendations around that. And that's something that I'm interested in.
Right. So Mayor Lott, thank you. So this slide here has those recommendations, and we have the data now, both from the observations that we have and the survey that we have, that suggests that this residential number could probably come down closer to that one number more commonly throughout the city, as well as being adjusted on the commercial side. So we will be providing recommendations on that. And then I think Andy was thinking down those next steps, is that getting the residential parking permit place in ready, so that when the Main Street revitalization happens and when demand starts happening more, there's going to be overflow onto those residential streets. And so getting ahead of that is really what I think if I can summarize this whole night, we don't have significant problems today, but we are on the cusp of seeing them become more significant, and we can get ready for them. That's really what the data seems to suggest. And looking at these recommendations, it's kind of getting us ready for those next things. But I think it's really good to hear that the enforcement areas, let's talk about time zones and looking at the meter and the pricing, and particularly in the downtown core. Those are kind of the next steps. And then mitigating the impacts of those overflows, because as soon as we constrain, people are going to look for the free option.
Could I say something also about just about the time requirements and that sort of thing? I know there have been some issues in my neighborhood with people sort of abandoning vehicles on the road, and they're being left for, you know, weeks at a time, and have called parking enforcement about it. And it seems like the rules that we have on the books don't, they allow people to do that. And so maybe we should also be looking at those things, and before we're looking at, you know, guest permits and that sort of thing, we should be looking at what rules we have on the books now. Because if it's okay for me to just leave my vehicle on the street without ever moving it, you know, and it's not, and even if I'm only allowed to leave it for 5 days and that's not enforced anyway, then this is sort of irrelevant, in my opinion.
Yeah. Good comment. Thank you.
Just one more plug is, I hope as the policy about the number of units required evolves, that there's some discussion about cost. You know, an average unit of multifamily housing right now is costing us about $300,000 to construct. About 10% of that, or $30,000, is related to providing a parking spot for that unit. Amortize that number over 30 years. And that means that that unit's going to carry a cost of $83 a month, every month, that single unit in parking costs for 30 years. That's being passed on to the person renting that apartment. So somebody's paying for that hardscape to get constructed one way or the other. So that balance of providing public space and also what requirements you're placing on landowners going forward, about what their parking requirements are and what's acceptable. I hope that gets visited in monetary terms too, so that people can understand what a burden that is for the creation of housing.
Great point. Thanks. I think we're, at least it was not anticipated, I think, in the scope is to advocate for any particular policy, but it is definitely to identify these facts. And so we're going to have the occupancy, we're going to have the vehicle ownership. And if we can say that this is how much it costs, these are all things to consider for the policymakers.
And I think also to that point, I think it's important to as we look at potential policy changes or shifts, thinking about what type of community incentives could we potentially get for that. So is it more open space? Is it more bicycle parking? Is it more transit facilities? You know, what type of trade-offs would we like to see instead if we are potentially going to relax some of those regulations? So you know, what does the community want to see, or what do we want to see more of going forward too?
Thanks, Eric. All right. Well, let's just give you a quick snapshot of kind of where we are. And I know that last time we spoke, we spent so much time talking about the model, and that has been going on in the background. Where we're at today is that we've basically finalized the collection of all the data. I think we're comfortable with what we have, what we've seen. We're calibrating the model to align with what we've seen. And that means that we have a tool that accounts for all the land use and the users of the streets. And that we then will come back to allow that to forecast out to the future and say, what happens if we change the number of parking spaces? What happens if we increase the number of residents on the street? And that way we'll look at those scenarios. Then we've initiated the regulation process. You've seen today kind of a snapshot of where the city is relative to some peers and some recommendations. We've heard now some additional aspects that we're going to kind of look into and investigate. I think that absolutely, Terry, that the first comment there is let's investigate what we have now and find out where it's failing us is an absolute critical step. So I appreciate that. And so we're looking to have another meeting in maybe a month time where we will be showing more or less the results of the modeling and to show some recommendations on the parking rates. So some of those numbers that are coming out of it and looking at how those future scenarios where we're going to say this street might get some more pressure in the next 10 years if these things happen. And that might then provide us a little bit more substance to say, all right, now what kind of policies do we want to play with? So that's the immediate next step. So we should kind of get off this call, and we'll be sending an email probably in the next week to find when we can meet again and to review that data and to spend a little bit more time with those regulations. So that's where we are, and we are going to go into kind of that middle of the summer horizon, I think. So we'll see how flexible we are to get some meeting schedules with people's holidays and whatnot in the summer during the school break. But we expect this to roll into that midsummer time period just to finalize and document things and to tidy up some of these questions and make sure that we can get a plan that the city can use going forward.
Thanks, John.
Right. Yeah, well, with that, I'm happy to take any last comments. And as I've said before, please don't hesitate, reach out if there's any questions on the pre-materials that we've shared. I know Andy will make himself available if we want to discuss some of these findings that he's had and thoughts on the recommendations on the management policies. So we're always happy to dive in and go into more depth what we've covered here. We cover a lot of ground each of these meetings and a lot of substance, but I know it's pretty intense this time of night. So thank you for hanging in there with us.
Yeah, just echo that. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you for your time. I also want to acknowledge that Robert did email me that he could not make it tonight. So just wanted to put that out there. He did let me know. I just didn't get the email in time.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you all.
Have a good night.
Take care.